You are not a guest, Mr. Thompson.
This is my property.
Not anymore, not according to the HOA.
You don't own a single inch of this valley anymore, Mr. Whitaker. Victoria Holloway said it with a smile, while two security guards stood between me and the land my father had spent his entire life protecting. Behind her, 20 luxury cabins sat along the shoreline like they had always belonged there. Warm lights glowed through expensive windows. Tourists carried luggage across wooden walkways. Someone laughed near a fire pit. And every one of them was standing on land that had carried my family's name since 1951. The cold morning air coming off the lake hit my face as I stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. Fog drifted low over the water. Wet cedar and lake wind filled the air. My pickup truck sat alone on the gravel driveway while rain tapped softly against the metal roof of the visitor pavilion. Victoria adjusted her cream-colored blazer and glanced at the guards. "If Mr. Whitaker refuses to leave, call the sheriff's office." She said it loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. A few heads turned. I heard whispers. One woman actually stepped aside as if I was some trespasser causing trouble. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody had spent years rewriting the story of this valley, and somehow, I had become the villain in it. Before I tell you what happened next, comment below with your city and let me know where you're watching from. Because what happened in this valley started with a family legacy and ended with a discovery that made an entire HOA wish they had never touched a single document connected to my father. 3 days earlier, I had been driving through steady rain toward Blackwater Valley after attending my uncle's funeral. The windshield wipers pushed away sheets of water while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. I hadn't been back in nearly 7 years. My father, Harold Whitaker, passed away 2 years before that. After losing both men, something pulled me back toward the place where most of my childhood memories lived. I expected old fishing docks. I expected muddy shoreline trails and abandoned fence posts. I expected silence. Instead, I found a luxury development. The first sign appeared nearly 5 miles before the property line. Blackwater Ridge Resort. A polished wooden sign with HOA branding underneath. I remember slowing the truck and staring at it through the rain. My father would have hated that sign. Harold Whitaker believed land should stay land, not become somebody's investment brochure. The farther I drove, the worse it got. New roads, decorative lighting, fresh pavement, expensive landscaping. Every turn revealed something that didn't belong. By the time I reached the lake, I barely recognized the valley. Then I saw the cabins. 20 of them, maybe more, built directly along the shoreline where my father and I used to launch fishing boats before sunrise. I sat in the truck with a coffee thermos in my hand and watched rain ripple across the water. Something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong. Legally wrong. The kind of wrong you feel before you can explain it. Then a black SUV pulled up beside me. Victoria Holloway stepped out carrying an umbrella. She didn't ask who I was. She already knew. That realization sent a chill through me colder than the lake wind. She walked to my window smiling like someone greeting a guest at a grand opening. "Grant Whitaker," she said. "I was wondering when you'd finally come back." Then she looked past me toward the cabins and added quietly, "Unfortunately, you're about 7 years too late." I did not answer Victoria right away. I just looked past her shoulder at the shoreline. The old fishing dock was gone. The cedar bench my father built by hand was gone too. Even the narrow gravel path we used to walk every summer morning had disappeared beneath decorative landscaping and polished stone. For a moment, I felt something I had not expected. Not anger. Fear. The kind that settles deep in your chest when you realize a piece of your life may have been erased while nobody was looking. Victoria seemed to recognize it immediately. People like her always recognized weakness when they saw it. Her smile widened slightly. "Progress surprises people sometimes," she said, "especially when they stay away too long." Then she handed me a glossy brochure. Blackwater Ridge Resort. Luxury waterfront retreats. Private lake access. Exclusive ownership opportunities. I flipped through it while rain drummed softly against nearby metal roofs. Every page showed cabins standing on land that my father had paid taxes on for decades. My name was nowhere. My family was nowhere. It was like we had never existed. "You should leave before check-in starts," Victoria said calmly. "Guests get uncomfortable when there is confusion." Confusion. That word stuck with me. Not theft. Not dispute. Confusion. She was already controlling the narrative. By the time she walked back toward the resort office, several guests were watching me openly. Others avoided eye contact. One older man standing near a fire pit gave me a sympathetic look before his wife quietly pulled him away. The social message was clear. Victoria belonged here. I did not. That afternoon I drove into town. Rain followed me the entire way. Blackwater was the kind of small Montana community where people still recognized pickup trucks before they recognized faces. Main Street looked almost unchanged. The diner still sat across from the courthouse. The old hardware store still had the same faded sign. I parked beside a row of mud-covered trucks and stepped inside the diner carrying my coffee thermos. The silence hit me before the smell of bacon. 3 conversations stopped at once. A waitress I remembered from years ago froze for half a second. Then she smiled nervously. "Grant," she asked, "you are back." The fact that she sounded surprised bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I ordered coffee and sat near the window. Outside, courthouse rain rolled down brick walls while low clouds pressed against the mountains. 10 minutes later, a retired fishing guide named Russell Kane walked over and slid into the booth across from me without asking. He stared into his coffee for several seconds before speaking. "You picked a hell of a week to come home." That was the first crack in the story Victoria was selling. Russell had known my father for 30 years. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed gossip, which meant what he said next carried weight. A lot of people thought the Whitaker land deal never looked right. I looked up slowly. "What land deal?" Russell frowned. "Exactly." For the first time since arriving, I felt the balance shift slightly. Not much, just enough to notice. Then Russell lowered his voice even further. "Grant, before you do anything else, you need to talk to Margaret Ellis." "Who is Margaret?" He glanced toward the rain-covered courthouse across the street. "The woman who resigned from the HOA board 6 years ago." He paused. "The woman Victoria spent years trying to silence." The rain finally eased just before sunset, but the pressure hanging over Blackwater felt heavier than the storm itself. I left the diner and drove along the lake road toward the north end of town, where Margaret Ellis lived in a small cedar house overlooking a muddy stretch of shoreline. Fog drifted low across the water. A pair of empty fishing docks creaked in the wind. The entire valley felt like it was holding its breath. Margaret answered the door before I could knock. She looked to be in her late 60s, sharp eyes, gray hair pulled back, the kind of person who noticed things other people missed. She studied me for a second and sighed. "You look exactly like your father." I smiled faintly. "People keep telling me that. Your father would not have waited this long to come back." There was no hostility in her voice, which somehow made the comment sting more. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and wet cedar. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Margaret did not waste time with small talk. She placed an old photo album on the table and opened it. My stomach tightened immediately. The photographs showed community meetings from years ago. Fundraisers, lake cleanups, holiday gatherings. In every photo, Victoria Holloway stood near the center, smiling, organizing, directing, always positioned like the person everyone should be watching. She was different back then, Margaret said quietly. Or maybe she just hit it better. That was the first time someone spoke honestly about Victoria without lowering their voice. It felt significant. Margaret turned another page. The resort project started as a simple cabin proposal. 10 units. Small footprint. Temporary lease discussions. I frowned. Lease from who? Margaret looked directly at me. That was the problem. Nobody ever got a clear answer. The room went silent except for rain sliding down the glass. I felt something shift. Not evidence. Not proof. Something more dangerous. Doubt. Doubt spreads faster than facts in a small town. Margaret stood and retrieved a storage box from a closet. I kept copies. She handed me several HOA newsletters. Most looked ordinary until one date caught my attention. 7 years earlier. Around the same time I stopped visiting regularly after my father's health declined. The article announced future development opportunities and referenced land agreements already secured. I read the sentence twice. Already secured. My father was still alive then. Barely, but alive. He never mentioned selling anything, I said. Because he never sold anything. Margaret's answer came immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. She believed it completely. That certainty hit harder than I expected. For the first time since returning, my fear began turning into something more useful. Focus. Then Margaret revealed the reason she resigned from the HOA board. Not because of disagreements. Not because of politics. Because questions started disappearing from meeting minutes. Votes were summarized differently than residents remembered. Discussions about ownership became strangely vague. You were saying records were altered? I asked. I am saying people stopped asking questions because every person who did became a problem. Outside, headlights moved slowly past the house. A pickup truck. Then another. Margaret glanced through the window. See that? She said. People know you are back. The realization landed heavily. This valley watched everything. By morning, half the community would know I had visited her. Social pressure was already building. Victoria's influence was no longer invisible. It was woven into everyday life. Margaret walked me to the door and handed me a folded sheet of paper. I almost threw this away years ago. I unfolded it beneath the porch light. It was not a deed, not a survey, not a legal filing. It was a handwritten attendance list from a private development meeting held before the resort was approved. Several names appeared. Local investors, HOA board members, contractors. One name stood out immediately. Harold Whitaker. My father's name. I stared at it in disbelief. That is impossible. Margaret nodded slowly. That is exactly what I thought. Then she looked toward the fog-covered lake. The problem, Grant, is that somebody wanted the town to believe your father agreed to all of this. I barely slept that night. The attendance list sat on the motel desk beside my coffee thermos while rain rattled against the metal roof outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's name on that page. Harold Whitaker, listed as attending a development meeting connected to the very project that now occupied his land. It made no sense. My father hated meetings, hated committees, hated anyone who tried to tell him what to do with his property. By sunrise, fog blanketed the lake so heavily that the shoreline disappeared completely. The valley looked erased. I stood outside the motel for a long moment, breathing the cold morning air, trying to separate emotion from fact. Someone wanted people to believe my father approved this project. The real question was why. By the time I reached the diner, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations lowered when I walked in. People glanced up from their coffee cups. Two men near the counter stopped talking altogether. News traveled fast in Blackwater. Apparently faster than the weather. The waitress set down my coffee without asking what I wanted. You have become the most discussed person in town, she said quietly. That usually means trouble. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. Or it means somebody finally came back. I turned and found an older woman standing near the entrance. Martha Jenkins, former county school principal, one of the most respected people in town. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult personalities. She slid into the booth across from me and lowered her voice. Victoria knows you visited Margaret. The statement landed harder than I expected. Less than 12 hours had passed. Martha noticed my reaction. That surprises you? She asked. Nothing happens in this valley without reaching her ears. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Inside, the diner somehow felt even quieter. Martha reached into her purse and removed a folded newspaper clipping. You should see this. The article was from 6 years ago. The headline focused on economic growth, tourism, and community development. Typical small-town optimism. But halfway through the story, a photograph caught my attention. Victoria stood smiling beside local investors near the lakeshore. Behind them was a survey marker, one I recognized immediately. My father installed it himself 20 years earlier. I stared at the image. This was taken on private property. Martha nodded. That is why I kept it. Another small piece moved into place. Not proof. Pattern. The most dangerous thing for someone like Victoria was not a document. It was a pattern. Then Martha shared something that shifted the balance again. Several residents had quietly tried to challenge the project years ago. None of them succeeded. One moved away. Another withdrew complaints. A third suddenly signed a support letter after months of opposition. People got tired, Martha said, or scared of becoming the next problem. There was no drama in her voice, just disappointment. That bothered me more. What kind of community slowly learns to stop asking questions? As we talked, a black luxury SUV rolled past the diner windows. Everyone noticed it. Nobody said a word. Victoria was not inside the vehicle, but she did not need to be. Her presence existed whether she was there or not. That realization triggered something unexpected inside me. For 2 days I had been reacting, absorbing, trying to understand. For the first time, I started thinking strategically. Not about proving ownership, about understanding influence. Those are different battles. When Martha left, she handed me a small handwritten note. Just an address. No explanation. Go there before Victoria finds out you have it. I drove immediately. The address led to a weathered storage building near the old marina at the north shoreline. Rainwater dripped from the roof. Empty fishing docks rocked gently against dark water. Fog drifted across the lake like smoke. Inside the building, hidden beneath a canvas tarp, sat several boxes of abandoned records from a defunct land surveying company. Most were damaged by moisture. Most were useless. Then I found something that made my pulse stop for a second. A large rolled survey map. Blackwater Valley. Dated 8 years ago. Years before construction started. And directly across the center of the valley, someone had drawn a thick red line around the future resort site. Underneath it, written by hand, were 4 words. Ownership status unresolved. For a long moment, I just stood there holding the survey map while rainwater dripped steadily from the marina roof. Ownership status unresolved. For simple words. For words that should have stopped the entire project before the first cabin was ever built. The paper itself was old but professionally prepared. Survey markers were clearly labeled. Shoreline boundaries matched what I remembered from childhood. Whoever created this map knew exactly where the property lines were. More importantly, they knew there was uncertainty. That changed everything. Until now, I had been chasing questions. Suddenly, I had evidence that somebody knew there was a problem years before construction began. I carefully rolled the map back up and loaded the boxes into my truck. The lake wind pushed fog across the shoreline as I drove away from the marina. Halfway back to town, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. Mr. Whitaker, a male voice asked. My name is Daniel Mercer. We have never met, but I think you should know Victoria has started calling people. I pulled onto the shoulder. Gravel crackled beneath the tires. Calling people about what? There was a pause. About you. That answer did not surprise me nearly as much as it should have. Daniel explained that he owned one of the newer cabins near the water. Earlier that morning, Victoria had contacted several property owners and warned them that a disgruntled former resident was spreading misinformation about the resort. Former resident. Misinformation. The language was deliberate. Not angry. Strategic. She was framing the story before facts could catch up. Did you believe her? I asked. Another pause followed. I did yesterday. Then he lowered his voice. Today I am not so sure. That conversation stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Something subtle was changing. Not publicly. Not yet. But privately. Doubt was spreading. Victoria's greatest strength had always been certainty. Once people started questioning that certainty, her control weakened. By late afternoon, I parked outside the County Historical Society building. It sat beside an old church overlooking the valley. Rain clouds still hung low over the mountains. Inside, the atmosphere felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension outside. Old photographs lined the walls. Maps covered display cases. A volunteer named Helen recognized me immediately. You have your father's eyes, she said softly. It was the 3rd time someone had told me that since returning. This time, instead of comfort, it brought sadness. Every new discovery seemed to pull my father deeper into the center of the story. Helen listened carefully as I explained what I had found. She did not interrupt once. Then she walked to a back room and returned carrying a framed aerial photograph taken decades earlier. Your father donated this. My chest tightened. The image showed Blackwater Valley long before development. The fishing docks, the shoreline, the timber ridge, everything exactly where it belonged. Then Helen pointed toward a small handwritten note attached to the back of the frame. My father had signed it himself. Underneath his signature was a sentence. Preserve the valley. Future generations deserve better than short-term profit. I stared at the words. Suddenly, the fight stopped feeling like a property dispute. This was about legacy, about intent, about protecting something that mattered to the people who came before us. As I left the building, thunder echoed across the valley again. Several residents standing outside watched me walk to my truck. This time nobody looked away. One man even nodded. Small gesture. Huge difference. Social pressure was shifting. Then another unexpected development arrived. A white pickup pulled beside me before I could leave. The driver rolled down his window. Mid-50s. Weathered face. Nervous expression. You do not know me, he said. but I worked construction on the first phase of the resort. My pulse quickened, and he glanced around the parking lot before answering. And there was a meeting none of us were supposed to talk about. He swallowed hard, because somebody asked a question about who actually owned the land. The man introduced himself as Carl Benson. He had spent 22 years building roads, foundations, and utility access throughout the county. Nothing about him felt dramatic. That was exactly why I trusted him more than most people I had met since coming back. Honest people rarely sound impressive. We sat inside his pickup while rain tapped steadily against the windshield. The lake sat beyond the parking lot under a blanket of fog. Carl stared through the glass for several seconds before speaking. The question came up during a contractor briefing before the first cabin permits were finalized. He rubbed his jaw. One of the engineers asked who held final title authority on the shoreline parcels. I felt my pulse slow rather than accelerate. For the first time since arriving, I was not chasing emotions. I was listening for leverage. What happened? Carl gave a dry laugh. Victoria shut the conversation down. That answer told me more than he realized. People confident in ownership do not silence ownership questions. They answer them. Carl continued. She said legal review had already been completed and anyone delaying construction would be responsible for project losses. There it was. Liability pressure. Financial pressure. The kind that makes people stop asking uncomfortable questions. By the time I drove away from the historical society, the storm had intensified. Rain streaked across the windshield while thunder rolled above the valley. Yet something inside me had changed. For days I had been reacting to Victoria's version of events. Now I was beginning to understand the structure holding that version together. Influence. Permits. Investors. Insurance exposure. Liability. This was no longer about proving my father was right. It was about identifying who would panic if they were wrong. The next morning, I made my first deliberate move. Not toward the resort. Not toward Victoria. Toward the people who had the most to lose. I spent hours speaking with business owners, contractors, and several cabin owners who had quietly reached out after hearing rumors. I never accused anyone. Never raised my voice. I simply asked questions. Calm questions. Questions that became increasingly uncomfortable. Had they personally verified shoreline ownership before purchasing? Had their title insurers reviewed historical survey conflicts? Were they aware an unresolved ownership notation existed years before construction? Most had never heard any of it. By afternoon, the social atmosphere around town felt different. People were not defending Victoria anymore. They were calling each other, comparing information, looking for reassurance. At the diner, conversations stopped when I entered for a completely different reason than before. Nobody viewed me as a disgruntled outsider now. They viewed me as a potential source of risk. Fear had changed direction. Around 3 o'clock, my phone started ringing repeatedly. A resort investor left a voicemail. A property owner requested a meeting. A local attorney asked if certain survey records actually existed. The pressure was spreading faster than I expected. Then Victoria made her first major mistake. She approached me publicly. It happened outside the courthouse while cold rain fell from dark clouds overhead. Residents stood under awnings watching. Trucks lined the street. Nobody pretended not to notice. Victoria walked toward me carrying an umbrella, perfectly composed as always. "You are creating unnecessary concern," she said. Her tone remained pleasant, but the edges had sharpened. Concern usually starts when people discover information they should have been told earlier, I replied. She smiled. "You have been gone for years. You do not understand the complexity of what was built here." "Maybe." I nodded toward the resort. "But insurance companies understand ownership disputes very well." For the first time since I met her, the smile faltered. Barely. Less than a second. But I saw it. More importantly, several people standing nearby saw it too. Victoria recovered immediately. "Be careful, Grant. Rumors can hurt innocent people. So can unanswered questions." Neither of us said another word. She walked away. The crowd remained silent. Yet the power balance had shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough. That evening, another unexpected call arrived. A regional insurance consultant working with one of the resort lenders wanted to speak with me. He had heard concerns regarding unresolved title exposure. Then he said something that made me sit upright. "Mr. Whitaker, if what people are discussing is accurate, the issue is much larger than ownership." I stared out across the lake as fog rolled over the dark water. "How much larger?" His answer came quietly. large enough that several parties may have approved financial commitments based on assumptions that should have been verified years ago. The call with the insurance consultant spread through Blackwater faster than I ever expected. I never shared details publicly. I did not have to. In a town this size, uncertainty traveled on its own. By the next morning, the atmosphere around the resort felt noticeably different. The lake wind carried low fog across the shoreline, and for the first time since I returned, the people walking between the cabins looked uneasy. Conversations stopped when Victoria approached. Smiles disappeared a little too quickly. Questions lingered a little too long. She felt it too. You could see it in the way she moved. Still confident, still polished, but watching, measuring, calculating. That afternoon, the HOA held a community meeting inside the resort lodge. Normally, those meetings were carefully controlled. Victoria spoke. Everyone listened. Then everybody went home. This one felt different before it even started. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking area. Residents gathered in small groups outside beneath dark clouds. Rain tapped softly against the lodge roof, while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the ridge. Nobody looked relaxed. Inside, every seat was occupied. I stayed near the back. I was not there to argue. I was there to watch. Victoria opened the meeting with her usual smile. There has been a great deal of misinformation circulating recently, she said. I want to reassure everyone that the resort remains secure, successful, and fully protected. Normally, that statement would have ended the discussion. Not this time. A hand immediately went up. Then another. Then another. The first question came from a retired firefighter. Have ownership concerns been reviewed by our insurers? Victoria smiled. There is no reason for concern. The second question came from a cabin owner. That was not the question. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. Victoria's smile tightened. More hands appeared. Residents wanted answers about permits. Investors wanted answers about liability. Property owners wanted answers about title reviews. Nobody seemed interested in her reassurances anymore. What struck me most was not the questions. It was who was asking them. People who had supported her for years. People who once defended every decision she made. The social foundation beneath her authority was cracking in real time. Then came the moment she could not control. Martha Jenkins stood up. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody looked away. Victoria, she said calmly, if everything was verified, why were ownership concerns discussed years before construction? The room went completely still. Victoria opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time since I arrived in Blackwater, she did not have an immediate answer. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 30. People exchanged looks. Some shook their heads. Others stared down at meeting packets they suddenly no longer trusted. Victoria finally responded. I think certain individuals are creating confusion for personal reasons. Nobody reacted. No nods. No agreement. No support. Just silence. That was the real humiliation. Not confrontation. Isolation. The authority she had spent years building was no longer protecting her. As residents filed out into the rain afterward, many avoided her entirely. Several walked past without speaking. One former board supporter turned away mid-conversation. By the time I reached my truck, I realized something important. Victoria had not lost control of the legal battle yet, but she had started losing something almost as valuable. The community had stopped believing her. The rain never really stopped after that meeting. It settled over Blackwater like a second atmosphere, turning gravel driveways dark and leaving the shoreline slick with mud. By the following afternoon, the entire valley felt different. People were no longer whispering about questions. They were discussing consequences. At the diner, residents sat in small groups studying documents, screenshots, and old photographs. At the marina, cabin owners stood beside the docks comparing purchase paperwork. Nobody seemed interested in Victoria's reassurances anymore. They wanted certainty, and certainty had become very expensive. I was standing beneath the awning outside the courthouse when the first official vehicle arrived. A county investigator's SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. 10 minutes later, a second vehicle appeared. Then a third. Nobody announced anything. Nobody needed to. In a small town, institutional presence speaks for itself. Conversations stopped. People watched through rain-streaked windows. Even the courthouse staff gathered near the entrance. The pressure became impossible to ignore. Word spread quickly that an emergency HOA board session had been called inside the resort lodge. By sunset, the main meeting room was packed. Residents filled every chair. Property owners lined the walls. Investors who rarely attended local meetings suddenly appeared. The atmosphere felt nothing like the controlled gatherings Victoria once dominated. Thunder echoed across the lake while rain hammered the roof overhead. Victoria entered carrying a folder and wearing the same composed expression she always used. But this time nobody applauded. Nobody greeted her. The silence followed her across the room. It was the kind of silence that makes authority feel very lonely. She began speaking immediately. There has been a great deal of speculation and misunderstanding. A resident interrupted before she finished the sentence. Did county investigators contact the board today? Another voice followed. Did lenders request clarification? Then another. Are ownership disputes affecting insurance reviews? Victoria attempted to regain control. These matters are being exaggerated. By who? Someone asked from the back. No answer came. The room remained still. Then the county investigator stood. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just professionally. He introduced himself and confirmed that multiple historical property concerns and development approvals were under review. The effect was immediate. Several board members exchanged alarmed looks. One investor quietly lowered his head. Another resident simply stood up and walked out. The emotional center of the room shifted all at once. For years, Victoria had represented certainty. Now an outside authority had replaced her as the most credible voice in the room. That was the reversal. Not handcuffs. Not threats. Credibility. I never said a word during the meeting. I did not need to. The facts were finally speaking for themselves. Then came the final blow. One HOA board member requested a temporary suspension of further development decisions until ownership issues were clarified. Another seconded the motion. Victoria stared at them in disbelief. These were people who had supported her for years. The vote passed overwhelmingly. As residents filed into the rain afterward, nobody gathered around Victoria. Nobody waited for guidance. Nobody asked what came next. She stood alone near the lodge entrance while fog drifted across the dark lake behind her. For the first time since I returned to Blackwater, the valley no longer looked like it belonged to her. And later that night, a phone call arrived from an attorney representing one of the original project investors. He asked only one question. Mr. Whitaker, have you located the original family deed yet? The attorney's question stayed with me all night. Have you located the original family deed yet? The truth was simple. Not yet. I had found survey maps, witness statements, photographs, attendance lists, and enough contradictions to shake an entire community. But the one document sitting at the center of everything still remained missing. 2 days later, the answer finally arrived from a place I had not expected. My father's old attorney had passed away years earlier, and his practice had been absorbed by a small legal archive company in Billings. One of their records clerks contacted me after hearing about the situation through mutual acquaintances. He explained that several historical property files had recently been digitized. Most were routine. One was not. By noon, I was sitting inside a quiet conference room while rain slid down the windows and thunder echoed beyond the city skyline. The clerk placed a folder on the table. My hands actually shook when I opened it. Inside was a certified copy of the original 1951 deed. My grandfather's signature. The legal description. The recorded transfer history. Every page intact. Every page authenticated. More importantly, every page established an uninterrupted chain of ownership that directly contradicted the assumptions supporting the resort development. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Not because of the legal value. Because of the emotional weight. After everything that had happened, after every conversation, every doubt, every rumor, every attempt to rewrite history, my family had never disappeared from the land. Someone had simply counted on nobody checking. The legal response moved quickly after that. Attorneys representing investors requested emergency reviews. Lenders demanded clarification. Development activity remained suspended. Several board members resigned within weeks. Victoria did not disappear overnight, but her authority did. The same people who once deferred to her stopped seeking her approval. Residents who had avoided difficult questions began asking them openly. Property owners demanded transparency. The valley was changing. One afternoon, I saw Victoria standing alone near the resort lodge. No crowd, no supporters, no board members following her lead. Just a woman staring across the shoreline she once controlled. She noticed me walking toward the water and forced a smile. You got what you wanted. The old confidence was gone. What remained sounded tired. I looked out at the lake. No, I said quietly. I got the truth. She did not answer. There was nothing left to argue about. A month later, the gate blocking access to the family shoreline was removed. Nobody held a ceremony. Nobody needed one. On a cold morning just after sunrise, I drove my pickup down the gravel road and parked beside the water. Fog drifted slowly across the lake exactly the way it had when I was a boy. The wind carried the familiar scent of wet cedar. A few residents waved as they passed. Some stopped to talk. Others simply nodded. Respect had returned without being requested. I walked to the shoreline where the old fishing dock once stood and stood there in silence. For the first time since coming back, the valley felt like itself again. Not perfect, not untouched, but honest. Looking back, the story was never really about cabins, permits, investors, or even ownership. It was about what happens when people stop asking questions and allow confidence to replace truth. The lesson was simple. Paperwork matters. History matters. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is calmly refuse to let a lie become permanent. As the morning fog lifted, sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the water. The shoreline was quiet. The gate was open. The valley finally belonged to its own story again. But 3 weeks later, another certified letter arrived from an attorney representing a regional developer connected to the original project. And according to the first page, Blackwater Valley was not the only property where questions about ownership had started appearing.